Thank you so much, Julia. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with the Scilab community. I've been a longtime fangirl of Julia's and the incredible work that she's been doing. So thrilled to be a part of all these discussions today. So as Julia mentioned, I'm here to talk to you guys about identity, security, and accountability. Some of the critical evolutions that are needed to help make blockchain ecosystems more trustworthy. Given my background and my work at the White House, at the National Security Council, where I was a key driver of President Biden's executive order on ensuring responsible development of digital assets, working on the counter-ransomware campaign for the US government, and then working at FinCEN, where I was the lead for cyber, crypto, and identity policy. I've seen a lot of really interesting developments in this space, including very promising developments. The conversations today with the crypto community are extremely different than they were 5 years ago at the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, which is sort of the UN for anti-money laundering, or the ISO for anti-money laundering. So I recognize that wonderful evolutions have been happening and believe that there is great potential and promise, but also great peril depending on certain decisions that we have to make and key features that need to be integrated into this system. So first, knowing that I will discuss a lot of the evolutions that are needed from a financial perspective. I'm a treasury person, so you can't blame me for that. But an understanding that blockchain is specifically is infrastructure for anything. It can be a database for any kind of information and facilitate transactions that are financial or non-financial. And that has really interesting implications, I think, for the types of participants that exist in this system and the worldview that both sides, whether from government and regulatory agencies, as well as from industry, have brought to this ecosystem. Most of the developers in blockchain come from a tech perspective and want to impose the policy framework that we impose on internet service providers and internet infrastructure into this ecosystem. Versus regulators recognize that this activity and that the first use cases that were developed using blockchain infrastructure were DeFi. When you call it decentralized finance, inherently the financial regulators are going to be first and foremost alerted to this. And that was the premise and behind why blockchain and Bitcoin were initially launched, was meant to be a decentralized payment system. But I think this highlights like where there's a fundamental friction in those worldviews between people that want to bring the tech policy framework into activity that is financial, and then regulators that want to bring a financial regulatory framework into activity that could be financial and also could be non-financial. So first, I'll state, probably unsurprisingly to those who know my background, that the state is that the reality of cryptocurrency has enabled illicit activity for years. I recently testified before the House Financial Services Committee, and there were members of Congress as well as other witnesses at the table who were stating that, well, ransomware has existed since 1989, truth, and that, well, we never would have been able to recover the funds or some of the funds stolen or extorted in the Colonial Pipeline incident if this existed via TradFi. I fundamentally do not agree with that position at all. I do not believe that ransomware as a service economies and their incredibly sophisticated ways and other types of cybercrime as a service economies would work if it were not for the state of crypto today. That is not because crypto is inherently evil or illicit. It is not. It is a technology. The failures here are failures of people and businesses that have not integrated the critical controls that must be integrated into these ecosystems to defend against the kind of exploitation that exists. I would encourage to imagine, for people that feel on the other side, imagine encrypting 1,000 devices around the world and saying, hey, please send this payment, like many millions of dollars, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, to this bank account number at this bank, this IBAN number, et cetera. And the idea that we wouldn't immediately become aware of that, because ransomware criminals know that not everyone's going to pay, and that we wouldn't then go to that bank, and that bank would have CIP, Customer Identification Program requirements, and we would ask them, hey, who owns that account? And then shut it down, hopefully, in time. And ultimately, we know that cyber criminals use TradFi all the time, and there are instances of cyber scams and frauds, like business email compromise fraud, that do use TradFi, like wire transfers, ACH, gift cards, et cetera. But I still fundamentally do not believe that it would work with ransomware. The whole point of those frauds is that you don't know that they're frauds initially. You don't recognize that it's a criminal transaction and a criminally controlled account until days or sometimes weeks later. That's why the first 24 hours are so critical to be able to ensure that you can get the money back in those cases of scams and frauds. With ransomware, it's not that ransomware would go away without crypto, but I'm saying there would be massive and largely less profitable evolutions that would have to exist for cyber criminals to be able to work if crypto fixed a lot of those weaknesses that exist in it, mostly driven by it being unregulated in many jurisdictions and states of non-compliance. So again, this is not crypto's fault inherently, but it has features that are extremely attractive to great users that want to build higher order economic developments and commercial applications like many of the developers in this room. But the features that it presents, the ability for me to send a wire transfer from my pocket to yours anywhere in the world without needing to use a bank, and there not inherently being any features built in to prevent me from being in Iran and you from being in North Korea. Like these are the concerns on the national security side, and those features that bring so much efficiency to good guys also brings great efficiencies and attractiveness to lucrative criminal enterprises. Also the reality though, authorities recognize that, hey, you know, cash, SWIFT, FedWire chips, they don't publish to public ledgers. It's kind of nice that I can see everything. I'm not sure why criminals are publishing all their financial information on a public ledger, but golly, I hope they keep doing it. I again, don't know why they want to publish it publicly, but the fact that we have these public, unobscured ledgers presents a great opportunity for massive amounts of data that have risen to a huge RegTech sector that has been highly successful in supporting more timely understanding of where financial flows go when the information is available publicly. So there's a great capacity in this space to be able to contribute to combating the illicit activity that the previous features that we talked about present in crypto. And this is important, especially when we get into privacy, because the public nature of blockchains, I do not believe is inevitable, since I do not believe, based on the growth of AI, I think that things that are like clustering algorithms that are currently proprietary at a lot of these reg firms, these RegTech firms, will probably be open source in the next 10 years and maybe even shorter than that. People are not going to want to publish their transactions on a public, unobscured ledger forever. So the only future of this space is privacy. And that's dangerous, right? When you take away the one feature that is potentially very beneficial to combating the illicit activity and the exploitation in crypto, its public, unobscured, traceable nature. If you take that feature away, then we're just back to inherently holding the risk features of wire transfers, instantaneous cross-border, instantaneous-ish transfer of significant value, cash, the actual like instantaneous settlement of it and peer-to-peer nature of it. You have both of those risk features simultaneously existing in one asset and without the risk mitigation of the public, unobscured nature of the ledger. So despite these positive features of being able to see these ledgers and lots of proponents saying, oh, like criminals wouldn't dare to use crypto because it's such a terrible way to launder, well, they keep successfully doing it. I agree. I don't know why criminals are using the public ledger, but the reality is that they are successfully doing it. This has not stopped or deterred North Korea from continuing to target the cryptocurrency sector for billions of dollars and funding half of their proliferation regime via crypto heists and cyber attacks. It has not stopped ransomware criminals and cyber criminals from their predominant source of payment to purchase exploit kits and asking for payments for ransomware, or the fact that child and sexual abuse material is predominantly paid for using cryptocurrency. So why is that? If it's not cryptocurrency inherently's fault, like what is wrong? What is missing from this ecosystem? A lot of things, some of the things that we need with regulated sectors and institutions, as well as capacity for governments. Prioritization, capacity, enforcement. Not everybody likes hearing enforcement, but I was a good old Army officer. I like my enforcement early and often. And also significant timeframes to holding bad actors accountable. A lot of the actions that we take, whether it's civil or criminal enforcement, if you look at the activity that it's citing back to, sometimes it's from 6 years ago. Even when we claim that, oh, it's the largest seizure in history because it's cryptocurrency, and it is at that time, but it wasn't when it was a theft 5 years ago. 5 years ago, it was $50,000, and now it's the largest seizure ever. But it wasn't initially. Like, should we really be counting that as a massive success if those are the timelines that we're talking about for enforcement? So there's a few critical elements that are missing from the ecosystem, and I'll talk about identity, security features, and then get into the core issue that I really want to talk about, which is accountability. So first on identity, and I know we've already had a great discussion on identity so far, so there's some good experts in this room. Identity is massively missing from the cryptocurrency sector. Identity is also an incredibly complicated issue. I'm very encouraged by massive growth that I've seen in interest across the Web3 ID community, but my concern is that most of those companies do not recognize, they're not familiar enough with the challenges that exist in traditional identity. So if they just import all the same problems and infrastructure from traditional identity into a system with less accountability, this is not a desirable outcome. You'll just have in a system that has less responsibility in it all the same pervasive synthetic identities that are currently rampant across the banking sector. So first, let's talk about what is identity, so that we can sit on the same level playing field, because that's super helpful when it can depend a lot on which perspective you come from. So first, identity means a lot of things. It can be my official identity to the government, like my name, my social security number, my date of birth, certain types of attributes that like the government authoritatively owns and knows, and I get issued documents for. It could also be my unofficial identity, my gamer tag and my terrible accuracy score and whatever. Like if I'm participating across a digital ecosystem or in the metaverse, that is also an identity. My existence as a disabled veteran is part of my identity. My credit score, my reputation amongst my friends, the fact that I'm known as a crypto policy nerd. Like these are all different attributes about me. And an identity is just a collection of attributes based on a specific useful context. And this is really useful because sometimes conversations about identity don't recognize that understanding one's identity isn't just about knowing one's official identity attributes like your name, your address, and your social security number. It can mean a lot of things. So this slide was something that I presented. I chair the CFTC, Commodity Futures Trading Commission Technology Advisory Committee, which is an advisory council to one of our capital markets regulators. We were talking about the need for identity across the blockchain ecosystem, highlighting that identity is a very complex ecosystem with lots of different capabilities. There's different components of identity that are needed. There's identity verification that exists in identity proofing and enrollment, basically establishing what is the identity in this account relationship that I have with you, like what is that identity, and then asserting that you in fact own it, making sure that, and presenting evidence to attest to that being your identity. Authentication, like when you have a username and password, or when you're given a PIV card if you work for the government, or a CAC card for the military. Authentication is now you've established your account, your identity, and it's coming back to that account and authenticating that is in fact your identity, so therefore you should get access to all of those privileges or services that it permits. And then federation, basically being able to leverage that identity across an enterprise with lots of different use cases that can point back to that same identity. These are important because in the anti-money laundering context, identity is a core pillar to a successful AML program. But this is where people misunderstand sometimes what is in fact KYC. So some people think that it's just that initial onboarding, and that's true. That is step number one. It is establishing, and with a reasonable belief that there is an identity that is real and that it belongs to this customer. So establishing that identity when you walk into a bank, or when you walk in digitally to Coinbase and you fork over some kind of identity, information, potentially documentation or non-documentary means to establish this identity. And then the institution needs to do some due diligence to determine how suspicious are you? Are you a known launderer? Are you a known criminal associated with certain types of illicit activity? What is your risk profile, et cetera, determining whether to open and establish that account. But part of KYC is not just establishing that official identity and then understanding your risk profile. It is also that continuous monitoring of your activity and the life cycle of that account. And this is critical because some of the solutions that are brought up in the case of identity say, well, you shouldn't ever have to be able to get access to my identity credentials and my specific attributes like my name, my PII. All you need to know is whether I'm on a sanctions list or not. And like that is not consistent with our expectations of anti-money laundering. We expect a more sophisticated understanding of someone's risk profile and throughout the entire ecosystem of someone's account relationship. And I remember once I was in a conversation where people were telling me when I was a regulator at FinCEN that we shouldn't be collecting physical addresses. We should only be collecting IP addresses. Like physical addresses are so old school. And I was like, well, it's not an either or, it's an and. You should be, if you are providing digital services, why aren't you monitoring IP addresses to see if they're coming from, like, let's say, a jurisdiction that's sanctioned like Iran and North Korea? Or to monitor for fraud, like getting IP addresses that are logging from outside of the pattern of normal consumer activity is a flag, it's a red flag and an indicator that there might be something suspicious going on. They may also just be logging from somewhere else, but it's one contributing factor to looking out for, is there fraud, in fact, that's happening here? And my answer to them on the physical address side is that the physical address is needed because that is what is useful for me to go hold something accountable. That is for subpoenas. That is for warrants. That is because you still exist in the physical ecosystem and I'm not going to go arrest your digital avatar. I need a physical place to go find you. There's a reason why we ask for physical addresses. And it was interesting to see that conversation. There was some reaction from the industry being upset that that was the purpose of collecting physical address information, and there's a variety of reasons, but serving process is one of them. And my answer was, we are in the anti-money laundering and countering terrorist financing game. That is what this regime is for. And it's entirely necessary in order to protect the system and the vulnerable populations that are being exploited by the illicit actors there. So I highlight that as more of a call to action for the amazing identity service providers that are growing and existing in the space. That identity is incredibly complicated and complex, as you all know, but think about the many different elements that exist, not just establishing that identity up front, not just authenticating over and over again that, yes, this is in fact me, and hopefully not a criminal that has purchased my, my password on the darknet for 18 cents. But it's this overall understanding of risk profile throughout the life cycle of relationships with the institutions. Next, security, resilience, and privacy. That's the whole point of Scilab's amazing effort on secure blockchain issues. You guys are here to talk about security and resilience, and this is. It's interesting. Blockchain presents a great opportunity for resilience and security in some ways and not in others. The risk features of blockchain require a very specific and nuanced understanding of what risks we're specifically talking about. An example here is that a security-related feature could be things like its permissionless nature. From a cybersecurity perspective of being able to attack the network and be able to take it over, from that kind of cybersecurity and resilience perspective, that feature might actually be a positive, right? Like when I think about permissionlessness in a very widely distributed and decentralized network, that's good from a security perspective if cyber criminals can't meaningfully and likely be able to take over the network. But that also means that my abilities on a security side to counter illicit finance and to be able to roll back a transaction that has been exploited by illicit actors, like the immutable nature of the ledger is not actually always a desirable feature when it's an exploit-related transaction. So security is multidimensional, and we have to think about it from which specific risks are we talking about, and what is the right aggregation of different features that we think mitigate the appropriate risks, and what is the proper acceptance of risk that we're okay with taking on. There are frameworks that I feel that a lot of people that are working in the space, they're launching these platforms without doing proper security audits, without understanding cybersecurity products. Even companies in this space that state that they are cyber companies focused on blockchain have said things to me like that they don't know what the CVE list is, which is the Common Vulnerability and Exploit list that is maintained by NIST and MITRE. And I was like, okay. Well, and they didn't know what an ISAC was, Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, that every single critical infrastructure sector has that shares cyber threat indicators with each other. Most very, very common issues in the cybersecurity space were not known in the cyber blockchain space. That doesn't mean that there's not potential goodness there, but there's some maturization that's needed even on the RegTech side for security. So whether it's leveraging things like the cybersecurity framework when thinking about implementing blockchain inside of your use cases and inside of your companies, or even looking to frameworks like the privacy framework. I certainly don't see that being leveraged for a bunch of publicly published financial information and transactions. Like I mentioned before, I think that it's a consumer nightmare, the fact that we publish all of this financial information publicly, and I don't think that that is inevitably the future. I do think that the privacy enhancing technologies is the only way that the future of this technology probably works in a meaningful way. So I'm very excited about those technologies, but they have a lot of room to grow as well. Still lots of issues with scalability and application, and they're often presented by members of the ecosystem as saying, zero knowledge proofs and homomorphic encryption will solve all of our problems. Except the answer for them is, I just wanted to answer a 0 or a 1, a yes or a no. Is it on the sanctions list? And I'm like, that is not consistent with the strict liability requirement for sanctions compliance anyway. Strict liability basically meaning that even if you don't know that they're a sanctioned actor and you conduct a transaction or provide material support to them for that, you are still guilty of a sanctions violation. Now, I didn't make up strict liability. That is the standard, though, in the United States. And so there's a lot more to just checking to see if this certain crypto address or wallet is on the sanctions list. There's a lot more behind KYC and understanding your customer and your risk profile than just a 0 or a 1, a yes or no check against a binary list. I would still take more of those features being integrated into the system. There are not many protocols, certainly, that build those in from the beginning, but there's a lot more complexity that exists inside of these systems and why we need programs and systems for things like governance and discoverability. The core issue on privacy that I see, especially here, is that many people advocate for privacy, and when you unpack that, what they really mean is anonymity. Those are not the same thing. Privacy typically does not mean the absence of any data. Privacy typically means that there is very sensitive data that can be disclosed or discovered under certain conditions, permissions, and protections. So you can achieve privacy via anonymity, but that's normally not the case. So the real discussions that need to happen here for the future of all blockchain platforms, but also especially for cryptocurrency and for central bank digital currencies, isn't believing that the future is going to be complete anonymity, especially for financial use cases. We've talked here that this is a really unique technology because now for the first time ever, rails that were traditionally bifurcated for financial activity, like Fedwire and SWIFT, and then for internet activity, are now being conducted on the same rails. And with the right obfuscation, you can't tell which is happening, whether it's financial or non-financial. This presents a very interesting policy and technical issue and challenge, and hopefully market space and opportunity for trying to distinguish what is happening, because we demand a different level of privacy in our internet activity than we do in our financial activity. I will talk about some policy evolutions that are happening, though, that are starting to really try to expose more information and make more discoverable in the internet world. But there's a lot of arguments in finance, again, DeFi, saying, anonymity. And I'm like, once you called it DeFi, you lost that fight for anonymity. It's not going to be anonymity. I'm not saying that everything should be discoverable. The argument must be framed around what information can be discoverable by whom and under what conditions. And there's some very sticky issues there. Issues like consent will be debated and discussed. Consent is not always a condition that we have in discoverability. That is certainly what many members of the crypto industry want, but that is not what we have in law enforcement regimes. So that's one example. There's many different features that need to be discussed, but that's the right grounding for a discussion around privacy and crypto and blockchain. I have this slide to showcase some of the great research and work that Julia has done before, that basically the security features across central bank digital currencies and other blockchain applications and their attack vectors are unique based on design choices. And we need to consider specifically in a detailed way to this level of detail and rigor, really thinking about what are the different risks that we accept through certain design choices and what are the right combination of mitigation features. So some of the mitigations that I think that we should be considering to evolve inside the crypto space, besides looking at privacy-enhancing technologies and certainly improving things like key management that have been major culprits in a lot of the cybersecurity attacks against blockchain and DeFi systems, is also I'm going to make a pitch to the group about the automated indicator sharing program. That's the diagram that you see on the left side of the screen. In the hard cyber world, for any cyber people here, you may be familiar with this, there's an automated indicator sharing program that DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, operates with industry, where basically they enable the sharing of sanitized, machine-readable, real-time cyber threat indicators across all 16 critical infrastructure sectors. And that means things like financial services, it means waste and water, it means energy, it means transportation, chemical. These are all different critical infrastructure sectors, and they are all sharing in a real-time way these cyber threat indicators with each other. The crypto sector is not doing that. For the most part, the cryptocurrency sector has not joined the financial services ISAC. And for the ones that don't want to either admit or are not financial, they have not joined the IT ISAC. However, there is also an effort to create a crypto ISAC that is currently underway. And hopefully that will work. That is an interesting evolution. That is a mark of maturization that is happening in this space. But either way, there's other evolutions that are needed. There are standards behind how these indicators are shared with each other. There's a language behind how these indicators are shared called sticks, and then the way that the machines can actually send the information to each other called taxi. Why haven't these either been evolved by OASIS, the standards group that manages them, or a whole other standards body? I'm dispassionate about where it ends up sitting, but why are there not standards around sharing crypto threat indicators? This is highly structured, understood data. Every major company that deals in this space knows what this information looks like. This is ripe for standards development and reg tech development capabilities to enable us to create the infrastructure to dare criminals to launder on a public ledger. The sector is capable for it. There just hasn't been the organization because decentralized communities have a hard time organizing. But there is ripe opportunity here for partnership. And then my closing comments are going to be focused on accountability, which is actually the only real feature that I think is truly uniquely challenging in the blockchain space. Every other feature, at least in some way, exists in other parts of industry and other parts of finance. Maybe it's unique aggregation of different features together, but those features do show up in the traditional space. Decentralization presents a real challenge for accountability. Me wrapping my arms around a person, and that is a very broad definition under most statutes and regulatory regimes, to go say, you are responsible for this. And to a certain extent, this space was designed to avoid accountability. It was specifically designed to say, catch me if you can, and that has been the design of many in industry. Not all at all. In fact, again, the evolution in the space has also driven a lot of really encouraging conversations around what accountability should look like and where it should sit. As part of the CFTC TAC that I mentioned that I chair before, we published an 80-page report on decentralized finance, presenting a framework for how regulators should be thinking about DeFi. But the central concern that we highlighted was this lack of clear lines of responsibility and accountability. We started by trying to define what was DeFi. We did our best to create a functional definition, but then also in the same breath said, also defining it is extremely hard and it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. The reality is that DeFi exists on many different dimensions and axes. There's functional dimensions that can be very centralized in one column and very decentralized in another. Things like access and governance and development. And then on the technology side, whether it's use of smart contracts or distributed ledgers or DAOs, some of these things can be very centralized and others can be very decentralized. So that's hard, especially when you think about the fact that decentralization and centralization is not a binary, a 0 or a 1. They exist on a spectrum. So that's lots of different axes existing somewhere on the spectrum, creating a one-size-fits-all for here, you're decentralized enough, so you're not regulated. That's very hard to do, and also governments don't really have an incentive to give you that answer, right? To give you exactly the arbitrage line to get decentralized enough behind this line so that you're not subject to the critical controls that we require and expect in these spaces. We also mapped out the DeFi tech stack. It's all available in the report, but this just highlights that we tried to map out, in our view, the 8 different layers and some of the key players that exist in this space. That's important when you're thinking in the future about, if I wanted to adapt the regulatory framework, where would I put it? Need to think about what those key components are across all the other layers of the stack. This highlights the spectrum of decentralization that we included in our report, and the arbitrage line. So then here, the most important message that I liked from our report, besides highlighting that this clear line of accountability and responsibility is a core issue that must be addressed by industry and policymakers together on DeFi, is that compliance is absolutely possible. And this, I'll harken back to some of the discussions that we had about infrastructure being both financial and non-financial. So I know that there's a term that's used a lot in this space called credible neutrality. It was an adaptation from the term net neutrality and how we feel about not trying to favor one jurisdiction or certain players over another for internet traffic and processing. And this concept, it seems to make sense to developers, certainly, that we should be neutral, we should be credibly neutral in the way that information gets processed across these databases, across these networks. And maybe that makes sense in certain contexts when you're thinking about financial activity, like preventing front running and making sure that people that have all the money in the system maybe don't get beneficial or preferential treatment to have their transaction processed first, or in a way that ends up diminishing marginalized populations or people that are less wealthy, et cetera. But in illicit finance, over 200 jurisdictions that are members of the FATF have agreed that neutrality is not a credible position on illicit finance. It is not. Credible neutrality does not work for anti-money laundering. So when it's financial activity, especially from an AML perspective, credible neutrality is not a reasonable position. I do not believe that. I do not believe that putting an internet regulatory framework on financial activity is going to be the future. But I do believe that, again, there's infrastructure here that supports financial and non-financial activity. We have to figure out how to make this meaningful distinction. So we mapped out how compliance is possible. It was an adaptation from the slide I showed you earlier, mapping out the tech stack and who the key players are. We identified some examples. This is not comprehensive in any way, but there are compliance features that you can put at every level in the stack. And this is needed because if you don't mitigate the risk at the application layer, if I can't mitigate the risk by focusing regulation exclusively on exchanges, which is where they sit at the application layer, then regulators are going to look elsewhere in the stack. Where else would you like the regulatory framework to sit? In my view, the most obvious places to go are either end user, network, or protocol. Those are the easiest. If you can't do it at the application, and I prefer application. It's closest to the consumer. It's the one making all the money. I like application layer focused regulation. We prefer that. I don't like end user focused regulation. That's the IRS framework. It's the hardest to scale. It's everyone's least favorite regulatory framework. It has to exist at the end user level, but it's hard. And we like going after the intermediaries, the ones making all the money, their centers of gravity in the space, the ones with the most visibility and control. So to me, that's protocol or network. Different players across the crypto ecosystem feel very differently about where that should be. And the reality is, I'm not a regulator. Who cares what I think? Where do you guys think this should sit? That's the conversation that's needed between industry, the people that are being regulated, and with the policymakers. But those are the kinds of issues that they're having to address. And then finally, I want to alert you guys to the fact that accountability is also growing beyond just finance. There are some policy developments that I'm not seeing recognized across much of the blockchain and crypto ecosystem. People here may have already been discussing it, but I want to alert it because I think it's very possible that a lot of players in this space are potentially or definitely going to be implicated by this. So for example, there was an executive order under President Trump, and President Biden upheld it, called the Infrastructure as a Service EO. That's the colloquial term for it. But essentially, it is imposing know your customer obligations on infrastructure as a service providers. As I read that definition, I feel that there are a lot of blockchain platforms that are covered underneath that. In fact, many of them advertise themselves specifically as not money services businesses because they are infrastructure and infrastructure as a service. We highlighted it in the DeFi report, but that kind of issue, and there's an open comment period, it might still be open actually right now, that the Department of Commerce has published, and I would encourage the sector to take a look and to provide feedback to the Department of Commerce. And either way, to understand the fact that we are moving towards accountability in tech and infrastructure and software in a way that we never have before. We're also doing cyber reporting. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, under DHS, has just published, also an open comment period right now, a proposed rule on cyber incident reporting for critical infrastructure. And I feel it is not an opt-in approach. It's just you are a sector or not. We talked about blockchain infrastructure being infrastructure for the financial sector and IT and potentially lots of other things. I think that lots of blockchain platforms are critical infrastructure and will potentially have these cyber incident reporting obligations, as well as ransomware payment reporting obligations to CISA underneath these regulations. AI is being regulated directly, and I do not like regulation of general purpose technologies. That's why, we normally in the US regulate the application of a technology in a regulated kind of service or application like finance or healthcare. But one of the exceptions that we have for regulating the specific tech is when it can be a munition. And that was kind of invoked in the artificial intelligence EO, where the idea of human capacity for AI is essentially in the next 3 to 5 years, which many CEOs are stating. In fact, Elon Musk is saying that will happen within the next year. That's human level capacity for great economic development and potential, but also human level capacity for chem, bio, rad, nuclear proliferation and design capability and command control of malicious cyber operations. As a former chemical officer in the Army and as a cyber dork, that is horrifying. So again, AI is super exciting. Also, God, it's scary. And then I also think that AI and blockchain have really interesting convergences where these two technologies reinforce each other's best and worst traits in really, really interesting ways. So I wanted to close with this call to action on thinking about what should accountability look like in the ecosystem and recognizing that accountability isn't only for the financial applications. There is a lot trending towards and thinking about what accountability looks like, even in tech and internet and infrastructure activity. And the blockchain sector, I hope, they've certainly engaged a lot in the financial regulatory discussions, and I hope that they certainly come to the table for a lot of the infrastructure and other tech accountability discussions that are ongoing. Thank you so much. I know I just came on time. If you want me to, I can move on, or I can ask if there's any questions, whichever you like. Okay, great. Thank you guys. If there is any questions, please let me know, and I'm happy to chat with you afterwards. But it's been lovely chatting with you all. Thank you. I was going to say, I know I said some controversial things, so.
Please turn on the mic. You mentioned at some point that zero-knowledge proofs are not the answer for privacy. Is what you mean to say that zero-knowledge proofs as a privacy method are not compatible with existing detective mechanisms or so?
Great question, and you're right, I'll clarify and give more nuance to it. It's that zero-knowledge proofs aren't the complete answer. Some people present it as if they'll solve everything, and well, they're one part of an architecture that you need to think about. It requires thinking about what governance is, there's all those decisions about what information should be discoverable to whom. For law enforcement and due process use cases, for example, zero-knowledge proofs with no potential for discoverability, potentially not an acceptable answer. Now, I'm also, I think that it would be unacceptable for the answer to be that law enforcement gets access to everything, which is why the discussion and the kind of governance frameworks to think about where it's zero-knowledge proofs, where there's certain, whether it's keys and tiered permissions that can enable discoverability, because some judges have signed for read-only access or read-write access. There was a whole NIST paper that they did, I think in 2018, on how you could design a blockchain-based system to enable discoverability by law enforcement authorities. It doesn't have to be implemented that way, but basically there's much broader considerations. Zero-knowledge proofs can be one element of that, absolutely. But the people that are relying on that to be the silver bullet that will answer all of of their issues on never needing to disclose any information to authorities, to regulated financial institutions. It's just they don't recognize the complexity of it, and they need to put more thought into what the broader ecosystem of the answer needs to look like. So I am excited about zero knowledge proofs. I just think it's one element of a broader privacy-based framework. Yes. It's because there's online people, so the microphone will help make sure that they can hear us.
I've seen it analyst at Moody's ratings, and I'm glad you brought us about the. Oh, okay. Hi, I'm a senior analyst at Moody's Ratings, and I'm glad you brought up the themes that you brought up in your talk, because that is what we have been hearing from financial institutions when we talk to them. And you brought up the disconnect between the tech community and the financial institutions, and we hear that a lot. You brought up the topic of identity, and one of the things that we discussed at Moody's, and in fact we have come out with a research report, is this buzz around digital identity, decentralized identity. NSA in Europe brought out a big report trying to standardize the definitions and bring it in the broader context of cybersecurity. Anything you have heard in the US policy circles from your ringside view?
Yes, so I guess on identity, there are NIST guidelines. It's not specific to decentralized identity, it's just broader, like digital identity guidelines. There have been rumors and reports and broadcasting from the White House for years stating that there's an identity EO coming out. Nothing has intimated that it would include anything about decentralized identity, though, and I wouldn't really expect it to. On harmonizing around specific definitions and things, I honestly didn't see that being a major focus in the proposed revision for NIST's latest digital identity guidelines. I think mostly just that there's certainly a lot of U.S. companies and industry that are participating in places like W3C and others to help engage in developing those standards, but on creating like specific taxonomies for what decentralized identity could be or should be in this space, I think it's more industry driven.
Agreed. Just so for follow up, U.S. has taken this approach of coming up with regulations through enforcement actions, as compared to let's say European Union or Asia for that matter. Do you see that approach going ahead when it comes to regulations around DeFi and digital assets in general?
So I appreciate that comment, and also that is the view from many in industry. I'll say that it depends on which regulatory framework. I don't feel that that's the case with like anti-money laundering, for example, at all. We've regulated via policy this space since 2011 and have been very clear through tons of guidance and policy, and our enforcement actions have been against some of the most egregious violators in this space. So at least from a FinCEN perspective, I will defend FinCEN's policy position to the end. I think that they've been extremely clear on the policy front. Most of the time when people complain about the regulation by enforcement position, they're talking about the SEC. I think the complication that I have there is that there are times where the U.S. framework gets bashed for things like, for example, the MiCA framework in the EU, where my position was like, we've regulated and implemented and enforced in this space much longer than they're still like figuring out implementation over there. So like we've been way ahead of the game on all of that. Recognizing that there have been calls for clarity from industry, I will say that I am not a capital markets lawyer, but as a regulator at FinCEN and at the White House, I would ask the trade groups and the advocates that were saying, we want clarity. And I was like, okay, I am not an expert. Give me the talking points. What is the clarity? Clarify the clarity that you are seeking. If you want it, like, I am here for a conversation with the SEC. Equip me with these talking points. I never, ever got an answer. I never got clarity on the clarity that they were seeking. Other than, for me, I felt that clarity on pathway to successful registration is a very fair indictment and something that I hope that we make meaningful progress on. But the issues of like the complexity of how we assess whether something is a security or not is, it is vague, it is ambiguous, like as in the sense that but that's not different from TradFi. Like the same rules exist in TradFi. The problem is the mass volume of crypto assets out there. When it's arbitrary to write some lines of code and to launch an ERC20 token, it's hard to enforce at that scale. So the reality is that it just takes years to go asset by asset by asset and to provide the clarity asset by asset that industry is asking for. So I do believe that there's obviously places for clarity, because otherwise law firms would be very happy to give these opinions. But I've just never seen very good clarity presented to me on what it is that is causing the agita, other than this lack of a very clear pathway to registration, which I think is a very real issue. Otherwise, I recognize that there probably are issues. I've just never gotten to get into the weeds on like what core is actually a problem here. I am hoping that based on some signals from the SEC, including even just approving the ETFs, that we're in a space of them answering some of the calls for guidance, because even if they don't need to do guidance, FinCEN didn't need to do our 2019 guidance. We didn't need to do any of it. Like, that was our interpretation, and we could have brought enforcement actions without issuing that guidance. But it benefited us and the enforcement officers that wanted to go and bring those actions for us to issue that guidance. I am hopeful that maybe the SEC will take up that call. Not saying that they need to in order to use their authorities, but I just, as a policy wonk, I see that it would be beneficial to everyone for them to do so. I think the hardest issue will be about DeFi. I see no incentive for regulators to tell industry, and here's how you are decentralized enough for me not to come after you. There's just no incentive for regulators to provide that answer until they figure out, like, okay, here's a reasonable, like, off-ramp sort of regulatory framework where, fine, you're kind of in the middle, or like you slide into, here's the new expectation and regulatory framework for you if you're decentralized enough. So they've got to figure out the regulatory expectations for things that are less centralized before I think they would be willing to come up with a line and an answer on that. Why I would encourage industry to be the ones to answer that question, because if they don't, government will, and no one will be happy with that answer. So industry should be thinking about where they would like accountability to sit. But I do think that that's going to be the core challenge. It's missing from the MiCA framework also. Decentralization is something that no one really, I feel, is super equipped to answer. So a really great question, not a great answer. It's very
No,
complex.
I agree with you. In fact, that's the theme we have been hearing when we talk to people from the regulation side. Thank you. I mean, that actually fits well with what our understanding is about the space. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great question. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Thanks for the great talk. You mentioned the possibility of holding accountable network operators, including like miners. And do you mind bringing up that slide?
Absolutely. Let me
you so
go
much.
here. Yes.
Yeah, so like miners, validators.
Pools. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about like the feasibility of even doing this? Like how could you enforce something like that?
Great question. And it's hard. I'll give an example here that I know is a controversial view. It is my view, but I'm not a lawyer, and certainly not any of your lawyers. So, so take this for what it's worth, and which may not be much. An example for minors. Minors may have sanction screening obligations. My view is, of course they do. If they're U.S. persons, and if you are validating a transfer that otherwise would not have occurred without that validation, because it would not have been published to that ledger, how is that not providing material support to a prohibited transaction? I would not want to be the person sitting across from OFAC counsel. OFAC is our sanctions office in Treasury, telling them that I was not guilty of a sanctions violation if I had validated that block. In fact, major U.S. mining pools, including Marathon, I think was the first one that I knew of that publicly stated, I remember when Fred Thiel stated that they would not validate blocks with addresses that were on the sanctions list. And they got roasted for it in certain DeFi circles. And they shouldn't have been. That's in my view, that is the standard. That is like the most minimum thing that you need to implement. With sanctions, it's tough because not every jurisdiction feels the same about sanctions. Not every jurisdiction feels that Iran sucks the way that I'm not saying like Iran, like the state, the people, very different story. But there's a reason why we've designated the jurisdiction. We've designated the jurisdiction. It is sanctioned. We cannot engage in transactions there without a license to do so. That is but North Korea is an example of it is It is the only sanctions regime that I see that is systemically at the UN level agreed to that this is a problem. And it's a wonderful example because it is super prevalently exploiting the cryptocurrency space. So I'm hoping that jurisdictions, as they implement the FATF standard, should be implementing sanctions controls. And in my view, the network layer is a wonderful place to start with saying, why are you validating those transfers going to Lazarus Group? Like, if the government spends time to publish information in one of the fastest cyber attributions we had ever done, to give the information to the public to say, this was Lazarus Group in the wake of Axie Infinity, hoping that the sector would not validate North Korean money laundering. That there is no other, you have to put it in that sentence, there is no other way to describe exactly what that is. And I've had miners tell me like, well, it's impossible for me to know. And I'm like, well, tell that to strict liability sanctions obligations, but I'm not even doing the hard stuff of like you deciding to wear a blindfold and validate and say, yep, that's real, even though you have no idea whether that's a fentanyl trafficker or a child and sexual abuser that you're validating that transfer for. I'm picking North Korea, and we've published it on a public machine-readable list on the OFAC website. Don't validate that block. Don't let them get that money. It is like this is not being used for good purposes. So I think that it's totally doable. It can be tougher. I think that there's different implications for identifying who those actors are between proof of work and proof of stake. And ultimately, we would need to determine whether they're U.S. persons, why it's helpful when I need the rest of the international community to also implement the FATF standard so that we're not the only ones enforcing. And hopefully this would be a call to action is like, how do we get this to be a common shared value where it doesn't require enforcement, but instead the industry says, yes, I will not be part of that North Korean money laundering. Like I was encouraged when like one industry actor did it, but then I was discouraged when they got roasted for it by their own sector. So I think it's doable. I think not every player at the network layer, I think, should be imposed to any obligations, or certainly not the same ones. This is meant to map opportunities and possibilities. And my ask to industry would be, who do you think should be imposed to obligations? And it's not the same ones. I'm not saying that at the network layer, you should be imposed the same obligations as at the application. You specifically shouldn't. These are different layers, different responsibilities, different visibility, different controls. But some type of controls, like I would take if it's on the sanctions list, don't process it, don't. And especially if it's on a sanctions list for something like North Korea that is globally implemented. Please don't do it, is my view. So I feel that this is an opportunity that's ripe for certainly industry engagement and discussion, and I hope industry galvanized and catalyzed action.
Hello, great talk. I think I'm a database person, so I'm actually the only person in this room does not know much about blockchain.
Well, then the infrastructure as a service CEO is probably of major interest to you.
I'm kind of concerned with the security of the data in databases. As you might know, that recently there are many incidents about cybersecurity issues, especially from a person like me from university. We are usually, the ITs are usually understaffed, and there are probably many small businesses, their IT might also be understaffed. So my question can be a very open question, is from the government role perspective, how do you see that the government can enforce or guide university small business to use the technologies of blockchain to help with the safe harbor of databases and data?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. And there are some agencies that have been experimenting with blockchain. I think the first agency that got an ATO or an authorization to operate on their networks for a blockchain platform was HHS, our healthcare agency. Fascinating, and there have been some really interesting implementations. I think DoD was doing an experiment on supply chain use, et cetera. So I do think that there's opportunities for the government to certainly to promote experimentation. There's been a lot of interesting work done at the National Science Foundation, as well as by DARPA, looking into and experimenting with with these technologies, and NSF especially trying to promote grants and research and development in this space. There was a research and development agenda, in fact, that was developed related to responsible development of digital assets that was required under the executive order that I was a part of. So I think the government can play a role through promoting that kind of R&D through things like funding, through stating it as a research and development priority. It was on the U.S. government critical emerging technologies list. Digital assets and infrastructure and digital identity infrastructure were both listed as critical emerging technologies that we needed to prioritize R&D in. There have been agencies that have put out requests for programs on different types of capabilities. I would hope that, because blockchain platforms present very different, or not very different, but some different cybersecurity issues and challenges and some positive features for it. But they need to experiment with what that looks like. That looks different for permissioned and permissionless systems, and especially for government. Most of their use cases are not going to be open public ledgers of a bunch of government information. There's probably some interesting use cases for that, but some people would like that for appropriations. But I think that the government, there's certainly systems that have been set up for things like funding R&D, government use and actual experimentation internally, and then standards work. NIST, the standards agency at Commerce, is very interested in blockchain. They've been participating in the Blockchain Governance Initiative, which is the standards body that Georgetown helps run, and is this global effort trying to focus on standards. But they've highlighted the fact that their biggest challenge in helping to create standards here are that basically there's not agreed upon standardized best practices. Industry would call for saying there needs to be a standard, and then NIST says, great, what are the best practices? And industry doesn't have that answer. Government doesn't build standards in a vacuum. They build it based on industry standardizing around standard best practices. So again, decentralized communities have a hard time organizing. So there's a little bit of this issue of like chicken and egg of like R&D wants to be based on good standards for responsible development, but we don't know what those standards are because there hasn't been enough experimentation to figure out what all those core features are. So I think that it's a mix of things like promoting R&D and development, agencies using it and experimenting in their own pilot programs, like a few of them have been, working with FFRDCs, which are federally funded research and development centers, like MITRE, like the national labs, like IDA, RAND, et cetera, working with academic institutions also and centers of excellence, I think are wonderful opportunities. There's tons of cyber centers of excellence where they should be hopefully working to try to experiment with this. But there's certainly room for surging that and focusing on it. AI has become a little bit more the name of the game right now. But I'm actually hoping that focusing on AI will elevate looking at blockchain. Like I mentioned, I think that blockchain could present really interesting applications to answer the issue of auditability and transparency and explainability in AI that we're having there. So I'm hoping that blockchain can help solve some of the cybersecurity and transparency issues that AI could. You know, if blockchain, some people are still saying that they're looking for a use case. I'm like, here's one. You say that you're good for auditability, like you're made for data integrity and auditability. Prove it. AI is exactly a need for data integrity and auditability. So I think that basically the government should be playing a role through promoting R&D, doing its own experimentation, and then standards work, but the standards work means public-private partnerships. Thank you. I know I've taken a lot of time. Thank you guys so much. What a wonderful discussion. Great questions. I'm thrilled to be here today and happy to chat with you all later.